who's presenting a research on reciprocal landscapes stories of material movements. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. As attendees, if you can please mute yourself when you join the Zoom call. And to ask questions in the Q&A session, please can you post them in the Zoom chat or raise your digital hand. And we'll be able to direct you to unmute and ask your question. And please note as well, the keynote presentation will be recorded today. So Reciprocal Landscapes, Stories of Material Movements traces 5 everyday landscape construction materials: fertilizer, stone, steel, trees and wood, from seminal public landscapes in New York City back to where they came from, bringing 2 separate landscapes, the material source and the urban site where the material ended up together. And the book explores themes of unequal ecological exchange, labour and material flows. So we're delighted to have Jane joining us today, particularly for us as well in terms of speaking to the themes of material and environmental exchange. Jane's been incredibly influential in my own research, and we're delighted to be able to continue some of the conversations we've been having this morning in terms of the operations of kind of dynamic landscapes and also balancing the issues of kind of locational specifics, but also within an wider kind of ecological focus. And Jane's recent publications include Reciprocal Landscapes, Landscript 5, Material Culture, and Wood Urbanism, From the Molecular to the Territorial, which is co-edited with Daniel Ibanez and Kiel. So Jane, if you're able to just share your presentation, I'm happy to start.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation. I'm so delighted and really, yeah, wish I could be with you all day, because from the so the kind of brief description of what you're all working on, and it's very exciting. Are you seeing my slide now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much for the invitation. And I also want to say, just mention how eternally grateful I am to Ed Wall, your very own Ed Wall, for all of the kind of like organizing he's been doing in landscape studies. I think that has been really influential and catalyzing, and especially, you know, for me in this project, his mobilizations, your mobilizations have been really, I think, important to a lot of people and their research. So thanks for that. So I talked with Emma and Tatiana about sharing this project, but also trying to kind of lean more into a little bit more discussion about the experience of the research process. So I'm happy to do that and kind of like weave that throughout. With I guess the constant reminder that it's like always, everything's always a work in progress, and it always feels like a big mess at the time. So this is just a photo of the school where I teach at the University of Waterloo, which is on the Grand River in southern Ontario, and something kind of as a landmark, the Grand River is also the basis of this piece of land, the Haldeman Tract, that was laid out in 1784, that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations forever. And as you can see, the little red piece is what they currently hold, because so much of it was rapidly sold off by the Crown. And so, you know, right now there's very ongoing land defense actions happening, and as well as just last week or 2 weeks ago, the Haudenosaunee chiefs called out for a moratorium on development within the Haldeman Tract. And the Haldeman Tract is, you know, it contains really large urban areas, including Waterloo. And so I think an important for me to acknowledge, but also to try to get to know more about what the roles and responsibilities are of somebody working, and also, you know, thinking and instructing about land development, which we are all in the design disciplines. So yeah, the research really comes from curiosities that I had as a practicing landscape architect, and really wanting to know more about the origins and backstories of the materials that I was specifying, and also wanting to connect the act of design, the assembling of individual materials, and all of their important design qualities. So like the sensorial and the tactile and the beautiful within a site, to these larger global processes of industrialized material production and development, and trying to kind of like bridge between those things, and also wanting to kind of contextualize this material use within its within the history of the ongoing history of global and kind of colonially established capitalism, to try to make links between what's being built, what's being used, and what does that have to tell us about how the world at large is working. So in a way, I guess, using the tunnel vision of the specific projects that I would be working on, and the most immediate materials that I would be touching and excited about as a kind of portal into I'd say, like, not getting to understand, because I think it's too much to understand, but to grapple with some of the larger contexts for why things are the way they are. So the research started, I was practicing as a landscape architect and really wanting to know more about these questions. And then I got a job at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and was working in the materials collection there. And I really, a lot of the emphasis was on cataloging and kind of acquiring new, eco-techno materials, which are all very exciting. But I think that experience really made me want to, we initiated tried to expand the database to start to include more source material, which happened, but also seemed like gargantuan, difficult task that maybe other people would be better suited for. And so I think I started to see like the possibility of research that was not so much about in the kind of like quantification or totalizing realm, and more about the individual histories, or like all the kind of the things that might be left out of the product brochures and the the marketing for these materials, which would include any history that was not being told or wasn't beneficial to the sale of those materials. So I basically started this project around then, and I began to kind of trace 20 or 30 different materials. And because I was living in Boston, I was really interested in, or I was spending a lot of time in New York City, and thought that New York would be a good place to examine seemingly or so-called like canonical projects. And I think at the risk of making there's so much attention on cities like New York, and also so much reproduction of canonical projects. So I think that's, that can be very problematic. But I think at the time I thought, if this is about using these examples to tell another story, then one approach is to use the canon. I think maybe now today I might choose a different approach, but that's where I was at the time. And so I started, looking at New York City landscapes and kind of amassing a big list and thinking about a variety of different, brief research projects. I thought it would be very brief, and I thought there would be very many, and it turned out to be, in the end, very few, and it took me felt like a very long time. And so as I was doing that, I also started working with and kind of collaborating with Kiel Mo, and we did a bit of a parallel research on Central Park and the Empire State Building. And you should all check out his book, which came out of that, called Empire.State.Building. And I think through that was a very interesting exercise because, well, first of all, I realized how different a building and Central Park are in terms of their kind of material histories, and the ways and how you might study them and how you might start to capture their dynamics. And so, that involved these kind of exhaustive exercises of trying to understand how various renovations of the park had moved materials around, from realizing just like the incredible, once you start thinking about what's in, a public space or a park or a building. This is a list of all of the animals that were donated to the park in a certain year. So this is kind of an extreme example of I guess it really challenged me to think about the kind of artificial boundaries that that I had, in terms of how I was thinking about what a project contained. So I think that led me to, in some ways, think about how I would frame this current project as one more of relating outside, of a landscape architecture project, and trying to think about it as a project about making connections rather than focusing on a single place. So the kind of main three, I'd say, methodological agendas, or let's say research agendas. The first for the project, I could sum up here as the first is about tracing a materials movement in order to see beyond its commodity status, or thinking about materials in motion. And I think that for me, that's I'm really inspired by the geographical research, a number of different authors, like these studies of aluminum and sugar, and Lori Palmer's exploration of mining sites that she does by firsthand visits, by talking to people who are, of a place, working in a mine, kind of like a real kind of subjective experience. And so this is, for me, the aim of taking something that seems like unshakable as a commodity, like a brick or a sapling or a board, something we know the cost of, something that one might specify, and to try to explode that commodity, the concept of the commodity, by imagining it in all of these different states, as it dissolves, as it like outside of human conception, embedded as part of a bedrock formation, made a billion years ago. So to really try to just think about it in these multiple states and places and relationships. So that's more about tracing. The next kind of frame or agenda is to think about this comparison. So I set up the book as a series of two sites. So thinking about the canonical landscape site in New York City, and then a source landscape where that material came from. And I was really inspired by geographers like Stephen Bunker and Alf Hornberg, for their theories of unequal exchange, and trying to grapple with what's happening in one place is affecting another place. And again, I think it's an incredible reduction, but for me, a necessary reduction in order to start to get my head wrapped around dynamics which are, I think otherwise, for me, very difficult to understand. So the idea is that by looking at the two sites together, you can get insights into how single transactions produce radically different conditions. So, a deeper mine, a deeper quarry somewhere, fancy new plaza somewhere else, an extraction in one place, that means chemical leaching and contamination and health consequences for in one place means like a newer, higher tech kind of exciting coding in another place. And then the third area is, I think, pertains more to the discipline or the kind of cultural role of landscape architecture, and thinking about how you could argue that every designed landscape has some form of cultural agenda, or could be seen as a kind of model for relations with, with more than human worlds, or thinking about it as like thinking about a landscape as trying to share ideas about nature, or like what is a designer trying to convey through the landscape? What are the ideas that are embedded, and how does that relate to the actual relationships that are occurring through the use of these materials, and how are those kind of reconciled? How far is that gap, and how are they reconciled? And so here's a couple inspirations. Matthew Gandy and William Cronin's work, which I think gives such a thick kind of context for, like, rather than just seeing the city be built in one place. Both of these authors, and I think there could be so many, I'm just showing so few, but really talk about how the development in one place is related to, the moving of wood, or the kind of cutting of wood upstream, or the gathering of water, and the infrastructure is related to moving water around. So really, really challenging the idea that there's any development's happening in a vacuum. So for me, those are the kind of three overarching goals of the project. And then these are the 5 chapters, which show these paired landscapes. And I think, these originally there were, I don't know, like 20, and then 10, and then 9. And I organized, kind of like slowly massaged them into this set of chapters for a number of different reasons. One was I was trying to get a set of 5 different materials that had different qualities, but also that would kind of lead to different types of stories. I wanted to have a chronological kind of structure. So each of the cases is separated by about 30 years-ish. And so the idea was to use that chronology to be able to talk about, changes in landscape architectural thinking, in global economy and politics. And so it was a kind of a helpful backbone, I think, for me. And then I tried to find materials that were emblematic of a time, that helped to, that were somehow happening at that moment. And I think maybe besides street trees, all the other 4 really kind of like are quite, or have an intensity at a certain moment. Street trees, I think, could have happened in a couple different times, but the idea was to really kind of key into certain themes of a time. And then this map shows where those, what those connections were. So just a few, these are a few notes to self that I made while thinking about how to think about the research kind of process. And this is something I just made, 10 minutes ago, but it's a reproduct, because I can't find these notes, that I had like boxes and boxes of this kind of diagram, but this is a diagram which shows how I would try to think through what the sequence of this writing was. And so there's a line in the middle, it's a timeline. And the top is the New York City site, and the bottom is the kind of production site. And so as I was doing the writing, I wanted to keep track of how, if the idea was that I was trying to bring these two places together, I wanted to make sure that there was sufficient weaving back and forth. So both back and forth above this line, so between the two sites, but also kind of back. I wanted to get a handle of like how much I was going back in time, like where temporally, I was at any moment. And so this just kind of it's like, I guess, a score or something like that for the chapters. And so I did this obsessively and constantly to try to kind of like weave the stories. So that was something that I found really helpful. And I guess I also say this because I think for me it was it was a huge learning, continues to be a huge learning curve in terms of writing and how, like, learning how to write, looking to other models of writing for inspiration. And so this, and also trying to think through like what voices were going to be spoken. So whether even like deciding to use first person was like surprisingly a big deal for me. I kind of at some point realized that was the type of writing that I enjoyed. So, but I didn't, at the time, it seemed like not serious enough or something. So just all of those things, kind of learning to piece together a writing approach and one that kind of structurally mapped onto the ethos or the agenda of the project. It was something that I thought about a lot. This is maybe just a shout out to Scrivener. I think also all of you are like deep in your super intense and, well, I'm sure like very disciplinarily rigorous research. So I didn't do a PhD. So I think I was making up a lot of stuff as I went along, but I really found Scrivener to be so incredibly helpful for organizing different thoughts and kind of shuffling sections around. And I think another thing about this particular research project is that because it's moving through time and these different spaces, there's just this constant feeling of superficial knowledge, and so and kind of like needing to dig into the geologists' literature and a lot of different places that were kind of unfamiliar to me. So I found this program to be incredibly helpful for both managing all of those different all of that different research and allowing myself to kind of shift it around. And then I guess in addition to figuring out how to organize ideas and how to map them into the project, another kind of big turning point for me. I also just made this sketch a few minutes ago, but there were boxes of these kinds of sketches where I think I also, like, as somebody who hadn't been really trained in writing, found it very difficult. And at some point realized that I could really try to get into the visuals of writing and to try to think about each chapter as a kind of drawing type. And so these are sketches of each of the chapters and a kind of visual like symbol that I really wanted to be conveying. So whether that was through, in the first chapter about guano, a real intensity of layer of like accumulation. This was the kind of theme the kind of visual, visceral theme that really came through to me from this material. So I tried to really bring that forward in descriptions. In the granite chapter, it was so much about kind of digging down and displacement. And the steel chapter, it was about these networks of connection, rail connections, like much larger kind of geographical moving of ores. The trees chapter is so much about ongoing maintenance and tending and kind of work, like labor and care for the trees. And then the wood chapter was about wanting to really get into the cyclical dimensions of wood. So from the lifespans and habitats of the forest to the decay, obsolescence, and means to stop decay that are part of the wood materials manufacturing. So what I found it really helppful to think, actually, I'm drawing. I don't know how to write. I'm just drawing with words. So that was a kind of big breakthrough for me. So I'll just go through a few, or kind of briefly through these different chapters as a little, I don't know, little image share. But then in color, so a lot of them are black. The images in the book are black and white, but the color ones here, I brought in, because they indicate a little bit more of the process of the maybe field trips or experience of the making of it. So the first chapter is about guano from the Chincha Islands that was used in Central Park, and it looks at kind of the industrialization of farming and the movement of guano from Peru all over, to Europe and American cities. Looks at the growing metabolic rift of urbanizing centers, at soil exhaustion, and a new type of Pacific slavery, and the development of the contemporary Chemlon. And this chapter involved a trip to visit those islands. And I guess I share this, these kinds of photos. I don't know, it seemed like a big part of it. And I guess I also maybe at some point realized that I wanted to bring the people I was meeting as much as possible as characters in the stories, because I think they're, like, on the one hand, they're also, sharing information about the past, but I think they all, their presence there in each of these different places was equally significant in terms of what it revealed about the history of these places. So the second one is about granite from Vinyl Haven, Maine, that was used to pave Broadway. So focuses on this moment in time when there's a desire to really smoothen the streets, and a lot of this granite is coming from New England, from Maine, and I'm looking at this one archipelago, the Fox Islands, and in this case, and it really focuses on the developing union organizing and the solidarity between paving layers in New York City and paving cutters in Maine. And so this experience was really, or a lot of this information came from this small historical society that's run by the grandson of somebody who used to do paving cutting. And so meeting with him was really illuminating, and the meticulous, organization and care and the documents of where materials have gone was really, I think I guess again, like, not just information, like the data in those documents was not just information, but the whole, I don't know, this whole historical society, how it's been formed, who's there, how they're gathering information seemed like equally important. The third chapter is about steel from Pittsburgh, from the Cary furnaces, and that ends up in Riverside Park. And it focuses especially on the way that both the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh and the Hudson River in New York City are both transforming, one through steel making and one with steel construction. And so it looks at, environmental change in the water, and also the role that steel and progressive legislation played in the construction of a new modern public landscape, like the Parkway what would become the Hudson River Parkway in New York City, as it's kind of smoothed over and made a kind of seamless public landscape, and all of the, kind of networks of ore and extraction that went into the producing of that. And so this is Ron Baref, who works at the Carey furnaces, kind of animating the abandoned Carey furnaces in Pittsburgh, animating their former life. And this chapter, is like kind of looking at the role of New Deal legislation in the making of, let's say, the role of steel within New Deal legislation in the making of a different kind of landscape. And then the fifth chapter is about tropical hardwood, but ipe, the slow-growing deciduous tree with extremely durable, hard, and rot-resistant wood that was used in just the first phase of the High Line. And it really, focuses on obsolescence, some themes of obsolescence and development in neoliberal Manhattan. And it looks at ipe as one of a sequence of species or approaches to arresting decay, and kind of considers the implications of increased use, access to global lumber, and the outsourcing of ecological risk. And I think in this chapter, this field research involved meeting with lumber suppliers. I think maybe it was like because it was the most contemporary, and because it involves a kind of controversial question about whether this is, whether we should be using this wood or not. It was, involved sensitive conversations with people who are both selling this wood, harvesting the wood, protecting the wood, like Merle here, who's working for a forestry initiative that's trying to support silviculture for this species and other species. And also meeting with people like Tim Keating, who was really involved in the demonstration on the High Line. So I guess negotiating or navigating these kind of very different perspectives. And then this, if you have like a few more minutes, I'll go into this chapter in a little bit more depth. So this is the fourth chapter, which is about London plane trees that were grown on Rikers Island and were installed in a planting on 7th Avenue north of Central Park in Harlem in 1959. So this chapter is about the beautiful London plane tree, Platanus acerifolia, which is, well loved for its beautiful bark, but was especially at the time loved by the New York City Parks Department because it's extremely tough and great at surviving in minimal soil with like lots of urban pollutants. And so it was so, so successful that it became the key street tree that the parks was advocating for, and also the kind of inspired the symbol of their logo. And so I guess around the same, so I think in the chapter, I'm looking at how the street trees are kind of an indicator species of the urban landscape and how they are used to reflect ideas about the city's health. Because they're alive and they only survive with a certain amount of care. But at the same time, street trees provide for people's survival and health. They provide shade, they cool ambient temperatures, they filter particles in the air, and these are a function of their vitality. So there's a real kind of back and forth required for their survival, and I think we can reflect our own survival in their health as well. So it's easy in a place like this to imagine that this commissioner's plan, as it was laid out, would have involved tidy rows of street trees, but it didn't. There was really street trees for a very long time were kind of planted haphazardly and were based on individual property owners' will. So they were kind of spotty and kind of based on individual initiatives. And this map from the early part of this last century shows a few exceptions to that, where there was already, planned LAs or like potentially good connections between existing parks for street tree planting. And one of those exceptions was on 7th Avenue, which is north of Central Park and is today, the neighborhood known as Harlem. So this is Harlem in the 50s, and you can see that as the area, while here the planning was really about an LA that connected to Central Park and was this kind of like leafy elm-lined street. Later on, the street was widened, taking those trees out, leaving just the trees in the middle. And this is a photograph of the wishing tree, which was a tree that was supposed to give you, which was also kind of cut, that was supposed to give you good luck if you touched it before if you were a musician and you wanted to have good luck playing at the clubs, like the many clubs in the area. And so around mid-century, this article describes this complete kind of eradication and die out of the city's tree canopy. And this really aligns with major municipal disinvestment, along with mass white flight as wealthier white residents were leaving the city, taking with it, a lot of resources and kind of investment in urban infrastructures. And so as this is happening, many citizen organizations work in the face of this many racially discriminatory policies and unequal municipal services. And so one of these groups, the People's Civic and Welfare Association, was doing organizing to address housing, employment, civil services, and environmental injustices in many different configurations. But one of the things that they did was demanded infrastructure upgrades and the replanting of trees on 7th Avenue. And so this, was a long-standing kind of demand. And 13 years later, the city committed to a large-scale tree planting on 7th Avenue. This is the first of 400 London plane trees that were going in from 110th to 155th Streets on a spring day in 1959. And all of these 8-foot tall trees had been growing on Rikers Island City Tree Nursery, which is, this is Rikers Island prior to the nursery construction. And for a couple hundred years, it had already been, it had always been a kind of dumping ground for New York City. It was a kind of landfill. It was close to the 1939 World's Fair site. And so kind of out of fear of embarrassment that everybody visiting the city would be smelling this landfill, the city decided to cap it, and Robert Moses, among other people, devised a plan with the expansion of this carceral complex on Rikers Island, to make a large tree nursery that would produce an endless supply of affordable street trees that would be tended by inmates. And this is, you can see the kind of construction of this. This plan was really sold as a kind of redemption story. So on the one hand, this former dump would be transformed to provide lots of, free street trees. Meanwhile, there's a kind of idea that this is going to be redemptive to the people who are incarcerated working the land as a form of restoration. But of course, it was very cost effective because free labor and free land meant that the Rikers trees would cost about half of what the private nursery trees would cost, and they would be grown precisely to the park's specifications. And so over several years, the dump was leveled, compacted, cover crops planted. It was the landfill site was a kind of very fertile soil base, but there was also a lot of off-gassing And in the first year, 14,000 street trees were planted, and the second, 30,000 more. Everyone was really surprised by how extremely successful they were. 2 to 50 prisoners worked at a time, and they were involved in all aspects of the horticultural process, from preparing seedlings to pruning and rearing juvenile trees. They collected seeds in the park systems, and plane trees dominated, but there were lots of others as well. And the nursery had really specific biophysical conditions. There were no predators and a diverse bird life, and things were pretty quiet. Although there were a couple things, like at some point a plane plowed through 666 London plane trees, and there was an infestation of black widow spiders at some point. But basically, the nursery was incredibly successful in doing what it was supposed to do, which was providing lots of generations of street trees to the city. So I wasn't able to speak with anyone who had worked there while incarcerated, but people who worked in the nursery were quoted with saying that they enjoyed the work, because it was one of the few places to be outside. But it's important to recognize that this system functioned based on free or cheap labor. On Rikers in the 1950s, inmates weren't paid at all, and by the 1980s, they were making about 50 cents an hour. So this practice is what Michelle Alexander describes in The New Crow as a direct and immediate kind of continuation of slavery. So over the 1980s, with the city's racially discriminatory so-called war on drugs, the Rikers population exploded, and the nursery was closed down. And here you can see it kind of being built out across the island. The nursery was closed down and moved to a park nearby. And this is Robert Zapala, who was one of the last parks workers to close the nursery. And here you can see him on the right. And here he's kind of sharing these images with me. Today, the parks procure street trees from private nurseries in Long Island. And rather than just focusing on a few, they have over 200 species that they're planting. And they're also, this is Matt Stevens, who was the head of the street tree department, and really has a lot to say about tree planting as a social equity issue, recognizing increased respiratory illnesses and historically poor municipal services in certain neighborhoods. And so there are attempts to address this, but they're extremely slow. And here you can see a London plane tree on its way. So over the past several years, there's been a very strong movement to close Rikers. The complex, which was thought of as an institution of reform and rehabilitation, is a indisputable symbol of a broken criminal justice system. And there are plans to close it in the next few years. So I think that this is the tree. I believe this is the tree that was planted on that day in 1959. And about half of the London plane trees on this street are still living. And meanwhile, in other parts of Harlem, residents struggle against this concept of green gentrification, where ironically tree planting and neighborhood improvement projects are seen as indicators of displacement to come. So I'll just end with this slide, which is Jill Hubley's map, which shows street trees by species. And this is this is an interactive online project where you can click on different species and see where they are in the city. And this is these are the 90,000 London plane trees. And it's really not possible to know exactly which ones were grown on Rikers Island, but it's likely that a lot of the mature canopy today that you might experience was supplied by the nursery over the 45 years that it was in operation. And I really like this image because I think it gives a reminder of the incredible amount of labor and care. In this case, of unpaid workers, community advocates, and parks workers that has gone into this magnificent tree canopy that is so present in the kind of aesthetic experience of visiting this place. And also that while we can tend to focus on heroic development myths of urban, landscape making, that the city really is a construction of a collective. So with that, I'll close this down, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Jane. That was fascinating. And it was really fantastic to see more of your kind of research process as well. I think for all of us, we're kind of, as you said, in the middle of those messy stages when you're just in the midst of it. And I think often, for yourself as well, what was fascinating was kind of the curiosity and kind of discovery for you that was driving you throughout each of these processes, starting back from when you described as well in practice, which is really fascinating. Just a reminder, everyone, to please drop your questions in the chat or raise your digital hand. I had a first question, Jane. Well, I've got many, but I'll keep it to one. But I was curious as well for you, like in terms of, as you're saying, discovering kind of the expanded relationships, the active building, this led to you to explore so many different areas in terms of disciplines as well, like as you described, moving towards geology. And I think at this point, obviously, the ecological crisis and unequal ecological exchange is affecting really all of our research, regardless of discipline. And I wonder for you, how much of this gap kind of both occurs and can be bridged at education? I mean, for yourself, both being in kind of in terms of teaching and in academia, to have these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's like things are changing. I feel like they're changing very fast. Even conversations that are happening this year are, I think, so different from a couple of years ago, and at least the schools that I've been in. And so I think one thing that's changing is that I think, this research I felt like was pretty marginal because it wasn't, or I was concerned about it like not being immediately applicable. It was like, well, so then which, if you're going to do this research, like which one should we use? Like what's the good material to use? And like, how is this useful to me if all I'm going to do is existentially question, each of these materials? And so I think that, there's a lot of tension between kind of professional application and also a desire to support the discipline and kind of the profession's own evolution, like constant evolution that's happening for so many different reasons, but to also remain critical of it. And so I guess I think school, like architecture and landscape architecture schools, are both professional schools, and they have these concurrent agendas, which is to both, like, we want to get jobs, like we need to be able to work, and we got to get jobs, and we need to learn like really tangible skills, but we also want to change, like the world is changing and we need it to change, and we need the profession to change as well, and we want to do this kind of critical research. So I guess maybe all I can say is that I feel I've often felt those to be at odds, and I feel like they're kind of less at odds now. I mean, there's still a tension there, but I also think it seems so blatantly obvious that like we can't just do what we were doing. Like we can't just like talk about like a new form or a new anything. So I feel like everybody is quite open, or kind of like is recognizing the need for disruption, that I think asking these questions is inevitable, or I never feel any resolution. Like I never feel that there is a certain specific answer, but I feel like there's kind of, it's more in the air that we should be challenging how things are built, and yeah, I guess that's what I'd say.
Yeah, fascinating. I think for myself, because I originally trained as an architect, and I went into practice when I was part one, And I honestly didn't really think about what I was specifying. When you're at that, for me, I was 22, quite early stages. And then in my master's, I particularly moved towards like landscape theory. And like, I think it was also that conversation of, you can't unsee it once you've seen it as well, in my opinion. And when I went back into practice, those were the questions that constantly come into my mind, is like, do I want to work with, when you have to work with a contractor whose every solution is basically pour concrete in, like, then it's have these uneasy kind of relationships suddenly in these questions. But I see Ed disappeared. Ed, have you got a question?
No, I don't have a question. I just enjoy listening. I also have lots of questions, but I appreciate Jane's response in that. So let's say it's never quite done. This is that sort of, this is a persistent, let's say, urge to question and to, I suppose, I don't say improve because it sounds a little bit simplistic, but to rethink the ways we do things.
Absolutely. We have time for a question, and if there's one in the chat or anyone wants to raise their digital hand. Julian.
Thanks, Jane, for that talk. Really fascinating. And there was one thing, and I know it's not the core of your talk, but when you mentioned green gentrification, I thought that's really interesting, because if we think of improving a neighborhood through greening and through better air and shade and all of that, but that is then seen as you said, future displacement, then it's almost like that becomes a sort of a paradox or a catch-22, where, so how did that manifest in your research? How did you come across that, and how do people respond to it? Is there a lot of conversation to be done there?
I think, yeah, I hadn't heard that term. I think I'm hearing it a lot more, but I think, we can think of all kinds of examples, like maybe every high profile landscape architecture project of the last, couple decades, mostly are taking place in like formerly industrial places that were like, jobs left, people really suffered, a kind of like new wave of affluence comes. There's reinvestment in like waterfront activity in the former port, like there's just such a pattern of that. And so I think there, it's like almost wherever that budget is has been a site of gentrification. It's a big generalization, but I think that it's constantly there. And at the same time, like a lot of those projects are kind of like remediating or like having these other agendas which are beneficial in other ways. So I think they're happening concurrently, but they can also be weaponized. Like, you can kind of like, I don't know what the word is, but like gentrification wash something because it seems to be there's so many more trees, or like that. You can see how it can be turned and twisted in different ways. But I think I honestly think that's happening all over. Like, I think maybe you just have to follow landscape architecture, and that's often a case where certain types of investments exist. Maybe sounds a little cynical, but I think when I'm thinking about kind of like high profile, large budget projects, it's harder for me to see. It's hard for I think most of the time that is the case. Yeah, what do you think? What's your thought?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to think what comes first, and this, the idea that maybe landscape architecture comes first and sets the stage for change, or whether that's because I think, to me, there used to be this idea of what comes first, sort of the artists and taking over warehouses, and that then precipitates the rest. But it's really interesting to see how the material space and that change is also required.
We're kind of coming to the end of our hour slot, but if there's a final question at all.
I saw Christoph had his hand up. Christoph.
I think it's an interesting conversation around the ways in which landscape is entangled in those relationships. And perhaps has always been, if you think about Central Park, creating a huge amount of value and development stimulus for New York, or Chinese developers starting with landscape in order to create value and perhaps also displace. I don't have any way of avoiding that or a solution, but I think it's kind of been implicit in landscape for a long time rather than being a new thing or a kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, the platting of Central Park was involved, you know, removing lots of communities of people, and but that has really been kind of like out of the story until I think recently. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Fantastic, thank you, Jane. I think we're at the end of our time slot before we have to move to panel 3. But thank you so much for joining us today and for your amazing talk.
Good luck. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and good luck with your research. Thanks for.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Have a good studio day.
Thanks.